Coming up in this edition of Tom Jordan's Got Issues, I speak with Scott Peterson's sister-in-law, Judy Peterson. Why Scott Peterson, 15 years after he was convicted for killing his wife, Lacy, and their unborn child, Connor? Why now? I'll tell you. This edition of Tom Jordan's Got Issues.
You thought you had issues?
You've been shot at in a train wreck?
I love my country.
Wait until you hear this.
I required that as a requirement.
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah.
She calls you a liar. This is, I gotta shake it up.
I can't lie about facts.
Tom Jordan?
Great to be with you, Tom.
You don't strike me as someone who's clutching your pearls.
Major issues there.
I don't have pearls.
Tom Jordan's Got Issues.
The issue of Scott Peterson is pretty complex. In a moment, my conversation with his sister-in-law, and you might be asking, though, why Scott Peterson is coming up now 15 years after he was convicted and sentenced to death row for killing his wife and their unborn child, their son, Connor. Well, his case right now is being reviewed by the California Supreme Court, and the issue being considered, did Scott Peterson receive a fair trial? His defense team says no. And they presented their case last week to the California Supreme Court. The court now has 90 days to make their decision on whether or not his sentence is reduced to life in prison, or he gets a new trial, or essentially just simply stays status quo on death row. So it's been a while now since the case was captured enraptured the country right now. So before we get to my guest, Judy Peterson, my conversation, let's recap the case. Lacy Peterson, she went missing on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2002. She was 7.5 months pregnant at the time. This series of news clips might jar your memory.
Scott Peterson became a national villain after he was convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Lacy.
26-year-old Lacy Peterson was reported missing on Christmas Eve 2002 by her stepfather.
After returning home from his Christmas Eve fishing trip, Scott notices Lacy isn't home and Mackenzie the dog is still dragging a muddy leash. 4 days after Lacy Peterson disappeared, the tracking dog detected Lacy's scent at the Berkeley Marina, the same marina Scott Peterson used to launch his boat on Christmas Eve.
As authorities searched for Lacy, her husband became the prime suspect.
A woman claiming to be Scott Peterson's girlfriend called the police tip line. Her name was Amber Fry.
The bodies of Lacy Peterson and her unborn child were found in San Francisco Bay, where Peterson had been fishing the day she disappeared.
What started with a report of a missing pregnant woman is now a notorious double murder case. Murder charges brought today against her husband.
Scott was arrested in San Diego with dyed hair and a suspicion he was heading to the Mexican border.
And when the guilty verdict came, there were wild celebrations outside the court.
All right, those clips they're airing on the Dr. Phil show. Almost 18 years after the murders, most people still believe that Scott is guilty.
The prosecution marshaled and presented a mountain of evidence that pointed the finger of guilt squarely at Scott Peterson.
That's Supervising Deputy Attorney General Donna Provenzano with the California Department of Justice, KFSN television reporting there. All right, the mountain of evidence Provenzano is referencing includes things like Lacy's hair on a pair of pliers, and that her body and that of her unborn sons washed ashore about 2 miles from where Scott had gone fishing. More convincing, though, was for a lot of people at least, and seemingly for the jury, was Scott's behavior. Psychology Today says that he seemed aloof and unremorseful during the investigation, and the trial likely convinced the jury to give the death penalty, that it was his behavior that really led them to that point. But Psychology Today also says that, quote, study after study shows that we are about 54% accurate at divining the truth from watching someone's behavior, barely better than a coin flip. And cops fare no better. Things we have been told are indicative of dishonesty and guilt, such as appearing aloof or unemotional or failing to make eye contact, are actually not good barometers. Our collective psyches are embedded with a belief that humans are good lie detectors, but in reality, It's just folklore, outdated pop psychology. Okay, that's from Psychology Today, but still police use tactics to determine guilt, like this, the Reid technique is what it's called, which analyzes verbal and nonverbal cues to determine guilt or innocence. Now listen to this from Dr. Pars Anders Granhag. He's a professor of psychology from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden.
But what research shows is that there are no associations between fidgeting, eye contact, nervousness, and deception. Within the scientific community, there's no debate about this.
Psychology Today and Cincinnati Law with that video. While we might be highly confident when we see certain nonverbal cues, there are, he says, no associations between fidgeting, eye contact, nervousness, and deception. None. All right, so in addition to Scott Peterson's behavior, we are going to look at some of the harder evidence and also the timeline of what has been presented in the trial and in the case, and that the evidence shows. Judy Peterson, she is Scott Peterson's sister-in-law. She has been an advocate for Scott for so many years. Judy Peterson joins me now. You have gone now on an extensive journey that has been something that most people would never want to go through. You probably would not wish this on your worst enemy, and it's been now 15 years since he was convicted, correct?
Yes, he was sentenced in March of 2005.
So in 2012, you, after going through a trial that was arduous and difficult, you finally got to the point, you and your family, where you were able to file an appeal. It's still in the process of that because you just appeared before the Supreme Court to argue the case that Scott Peterson, in your estimation, deserves a new trial.
There were a total of 16 issues addressed in Scott's appeal. And like you said, it was filed in 2012. It's a very long process in California to appeal a death conviction. In those 16 issues, there were errors in jury selection. There was an argument that there should have been a different venue. There was a lot of issues surrounding Scott's boat. This crime couldn't have been carried out in the manner the prosecution alleges without Scott's boat. And so there was a lot of issues surrounding the evidence of Scott's boat. There's issues about dog scent evidence that was presented to the jury. Basically, the judge did not allow any dog scent evidence in that was in Scott's favor, but the one piece of evidence that was not in Scott's favor, the judge allowed in. So that's an appeal issue. There's issues about jury removal, and then also some other scientific things as well.
I do want to go into the boat issue in a moment, and I'll talk about the one piece of evidence that was allowed in, and we can talk about the other evidence that was not allowed in. But when you bring up the case to most people, because it was such a infamous case, the perception is Scott Peterson is guilty. And there's been movies that have been made about this, and there's been movies that have been based, I think Ben Affleck was in a film. I think it was Gone Girl, loosely based on, it looked like Scott Peterson. And all the surrounding, circumstances with an affair. And the common, wisdom is that, Scott Peterson did it. But you're saying that from the get-go, the way this was covered, the characterization is that the coverage of the case was highly misleading.
I really felt like that happened a lot. As a family, we didn't necessarily walk out of the courtroom and then watch it on TV every night. That was just too much. But anytime we'd have somebody come to the courthouse with us, a friend or an extended family member, they'd sit in court during the day, and then that night they'd go watch it on TV, and they would just be like, "That's not what happened. That's not what they said." But we truly felt what was going on in the courtroom what mattered. We didn't think it mattered what was going on television at the time because, the jurors were hearing the witnesses on the stand, and that's who needed to hear it.
Let's talk about the evidence right now because that really gets to the heart of the issue here and what was truly presented, what was not presented, and then the circumstantial evidence seemed to really come to the forefront of this and what led to likely his conviction. You mentioned the boat and the evidence that was presented. I assume you were speaking of a single hair forensic evidence that was identified. Is that correct?
Well, there was a couple hair fragments of Lacy's on a pair of pliers. The prosecution never really tied that in, how that was relevant. Basically, that's something that's considered like a secondary transfer. You can't, a wife's hair is going to be in her husband's environment. That can't be used to create some, to lean towards guilt. So I think the biggest evidence in this case is the fact that Lacy and Connor's bodies were found where Scott had gone fishing the day she went missing. And what people fail to remember is that when Lacy went missing, we didn't know who had her. We didn't know where she was. And Scott's alibi was immediately released to the public. Within 24 hours. And I remember thinking, what are they doing? We don't know who has her. We don't know what their intent is. And if their intent is to harm her, they're going to go put her in the bay. And fast forward 4 months, when her body was found there, people thought that was an unimaginable coincidence. And it wasn't a coincidence. Scott's alibi was widely publicized. And there was even people calling into the police saying, you need to stop saying where he was. Somebody's going to go put her body there. And so when that happened, people just think that's a completely unbelievable scenario. And, that was actually the probable cause that got him arrested, was the bodies being found where he had been fishing.
So you foresaw that was a likelihood that if they release this alibi to the public, which they did right away, that it is highly likely that someone might say, okay, well, let's set him up
immediately.
And you brought that to their attention, correct?
I didn't bring it to the police's attention. I think, but when you look through the police files, hindsight, you see people calling into the tip line, other people calling into the tip line saying, stop doing that. I think from my perspective as a family member, I don't know how much I verbalized it, because you just didn't even want to go there. You didn't even want to think that it wasn't an option, that she wasn't going to come home. Everything is going to be okay. So, but it was just kind of one of those like darker thoughts that you don't want to have when you're thinking of, the possible horrible outcomes when someone's missing. And like I said, as a family, you hold on to every strand of hope that you have. So you don't sit there talking about what are the horrible outcomes that can happen here. You talk about what can we do to find her? How can we bring her home?
Yeah, and Scott himself was in the process also of helping to find her, at least initially, correct?
Absolutely, every day. If you look through the testimony in the trial, he was at the volunteer center every day. He hung flyers up. He talked to police. The night she went missing, he voluntarily opened his home up to the police. They searched his home. He waited outside. He gave them access to his vehicles. He took them to his warehouse that night. And so he gave the police full access to everything that night, and did everything he could to bring Lacy home.
You had mentioned that there was, the judge went through all sorts of different types of evidence, and he would not allow certain evidence to be presented in the case. What were some of the items of evidence that the judge would not allow to be presented?
Well, the one that our appellate attorney, Cliff Gardner, focused on yesterday in the oral arguments was some evidence surrounding Scott's boat. The prosecution alleges that Scott killed Lacy and then dumped her body in the San Francisco Bay with his 14-foot aluminum boat. And the defense attempted to recreate that. And they videoed it. And when they did that, the back end of the boat sank, and the individual doing the demonstration ended up in the water. And you can watch that video on our YouTube channel. But the judge did not allow the jury to see that video, and then offered that the defense could have the boat to go do it again, but only if the prosecution was allowed to be present. And you can't do that. You can't require the defense team to do their experiments in front of the prosecution, just like the prosecution doesn't have to do their experiments in front of the defense. So, and then as you keep going forward with the boat, in the prosecutor's closing arguments, he said to the jury, the defense never showed you anything about the boat, that it wasn't stable. When in reality, the defense had tried to do that, but the evidence was excluded. And then in deliberations, the jurors asked to see the boat, and they were taken into a parking garage where the boat was on a trailer, and a couple of the jurors actually got in the boat and attempted to rock it back and forth while it was on the trailer. And so clearly the stability of the boat was an issue with the jurors, but jurors are not allowed to conduct experiments. And so that was a huge issue, that the jurors got in the boat and attempted to do that while it was on the trailer.
Well, not to mention that a boat that's on a trailer on solid ground is much different than a boat that's actually in the water in its stability.
Right.
And staying on this boat thing in this experiment that was not allowed to be used because it failed. If that experiment had succeeded in the prosecution's favor, do you think that the judge would have allowed that video to be presented?
Oh, probably. In fact, there was other things about the boat that they were allowed to submit. So they had a woman in the district attorney's office who was about the same height as Lacy, who was pregnant, and they had her climb in the boat. She was alive, and she climbed in the boat by herself, curled up in a ball, and they took a bunch of photos of her, in Scott's truck, curled up in the toolbox, in the boat, curled up. So they were also doing a recreation. It was a series of photographs, but a recreation nonetheless. And but nobody was attempting to lift her into the boat. She was climbing in there and curling up. So also not a realistic of how it would have happened.
And how they even described it would have happened. There has...
Well, that's the other thing they don't. They just say he did it.
Right.
They can't say what time. They can't say when. You start asking questions and people squirrel on you.
In previous interviews, you have spoken about how your mind works. You have this kind of linear way of thinking about timelines and scheduling, figuring out when a person can realistically do something with a given schedule and the time it takes to do it. And so you've gone through Scott's day on the 24th. Well, was it December 24th? What was the year?
2002.
2002. You've gone through that day, and what's your perspective of someone who thinks this way as a scheduler and a person that looks at calendars? When would it have been possible for Scott to commit this crime?
That's just it. There is no time for him to do what he's convicted of doing. It doesn't fit the evidence. And we also have kind of a timeline of that on our YouTube channel as well that just outlines what he did do the 24 hours leading up to when she was reported missing. And there's no time for him to do what he's convicted of. There's evidence all over the house that Lacy was alive that morning. Almost every room of the house has evidence showing that she was alive. There's multiple neighbors that reported seeing her walking in the neighborhood. The police did not follow up on those with face-to-face interviews. And there was a woefully investigated burglary that occurred directly across the street from Scott and Lacy's house the day that she went missing. And the police ignored tips that could have been related to her disappearance. So there's so much new evidence. There's so much more we know now than we knew back in 2004 when he was tried. And it's time for a new trial. And I'm very certain that Scott will never be convicted again. You
mentioned people seeing Lacy after the time that she was supposed to have been murdered. The neighbor who found the Peterson's golden retriever, Mackenzie.
Yeah.
Explain that, because my understanding is that the Mackenzie, the dog, was wandering in the street with a leash still attached, but that was before these sightings that people said they had of Lacy with the dog.
Right. So at the time Lacy went missing, right away, Scott found out from a next door neighbor that she had put the dog back in the yard the morning of December 24th after Scott had left. And again, like you said, with the leash on. And so we thought that was related. We thought, wow, but as she continued to narrow down her time, she thought she put the dog back about 10:15 or so. And then you had people reporting seeing her, and it was not a lot of them didn't give times, so there's really no excuse that the police didn't call him back, just to clarify that. But Scott had just left at that time. So we knew there really wasn't time for her to have gone on a walk between 10 and 10:15 and be seen half an hour down the road. So it kind of created some confusion about the morning timeline. And then the burglary across the street couldn't have happened until after 10:30. So there was this like, what happened? Like the dog's already back in the yard at 10:15, and we used to try to think of scenarios like maybe she was still home and she just threw the leash on the dog and ran back in to use the bathroom or grab a coat or whatever, and the dog wandered in the street. The neighbor put the dog back. She comes out, grabs the dog, goes on a walk. But we were just speculating. And then our appellate attorneys, through their investigation, found kind of a lost police report about the mailman's testimony. Or I'm sorry, it wasn't testimony in court. It was a police report, like from December 26th. And the mailman said when he walked by the Peterson house between 10:35 and 10:50 that morning, the gate was open and Mackenzie was gone. And that was the evidence we needed to explain the Lacy sightings, and that she was, whatever did happen didn't happen before 10:15. It happened after 10:15. So,
and definitely a postal service person, a mailman, is going to be paying attention to dogs.
He does not only that, but he's also clocking where he's at. So as he's doing his route, he's time stamping when he comes back to his vehicle. So he was very well aware of what time he was on that street. And again, he was, like you said, very well a Mackenzie. Mackenzie would bark at him every day. We actually ended up with Mackenzie after Scott's arrest, and he continued that habit at our house. If the mailman was on her property, that dog was not happy.
In addition to the boat where he went fishing, where the body's being discovered there, one of the things that really seemed to turn the public opinion on this was when there was suddenly video of Scott showing up. I think it was in San Diego, if I remember correctly, but he had, I think, blonde hair. And the feeling was that he's trying to change his appearance and that he's going to flee down to Mexico, and that made him look guilty. Those were the news reports that were coming out at the time. I remember that very well. What's your explanation for that situation?
Lacy'd been missing about 4 months. Scott had he'd lost his friends and everything in Modesto. People had turned on him because it became public he was having an affair, and he was basically spending the weekends down in San Diego with family. And so he'd drive back and forth doing flyers. He'd check in Modesto, do what he could. And so the weekend he was arrested, he was actually down in San Diego with family. And people across the country who don't know San Diego borders Mexico. And Torrey Pines Golf Course is 30 miles from the Mexican border. And so the day he was arrested, Scott was actually driving to Torrey Pines to meet some family, and was arrested there. And they didn't say he was arrested in San Diego. They said he was arrested 30 miles from the Mexican border. He had lightened his hair a bit because he'd been, publicly had people coming at him and stuff. He was being recognized. At this time, he was on every tabloid every week in every grocery store. So he was becoming a recognizable figure, and he was not getting positive attention. So he had lightened his hair a bit, but he did not look, he wasn't hiding from anybody. The police knew where he was. He'd actually gone to Mexico at some point in February. He had to go for a work thing, and he told the police, I have to go to Mexico for the weekend. And he went to Mexico and he came back. And so he was, even in courtroom testimony, the officers did not testify that they felt like he was going to flee. That was more of a media narrative.
Yes, that was out in the media, and it was incessant. I mean, that was kind of the theme they were getting on. With all this, is it fair in your mind to say that it's the circumstantial evidence is what turned public opinion against Scott, and what is ultimately what led to his conviction?
Absolutely, and that's not uncommon. I mean, circumstantial evidence is what you have in most trials, but the rule with circumstantial evidence is that if there is a explanation that points towards innocence, you have to adopt the explanation that points towards innocence, and that's not what's happening in this case. Every single thing Scott did was viewed through the lens of guilt, and nobody can withstand that kind of scrutiny. But the law requires us not to, and that's not what happened.
What do you think? First of all, how did so June 2nd was the day Scott's attorneys were able to present their case, hopefully in their minds to get an appeal. How do you think it went on Tuesday, June 2nd?
I think it went well. I think Scott's attorney, Cliff Gardner, is just very well spoken, very articulate. I think even for people who didn't have a deep understanding of what the issues were, you could understand what he was arguing and presenting, and he just did an excellent job of doing that.
What do you think is the one key piece of evidence, or maybe there's more than one, maybe that's not fair to say, but the key piece or pieces of evidence that exonerates Scott Peterson?
What exonerates him?
Yeah.
Well, I would say time, but that's not a thing. But
what do you mean? But what do you mean by that? What do you mean by time?
Like, time is forensic. In a sense, it's a science. But you don't have time experts come and testify in trials. That's when you start talking about people's alibis. That's in essence exonerating. If Scott would have been with somebody on December 24th that could vouch for where he was, he'd have an alibi. But even with that, you have people who are convicted of murder who have people come in and say he wasn't there, he was with me. And you can have, there's been cases where 10 people would say he wasn't there, he was with me, and the jury just chooses not to believe those witnesses and still convict. So anyway, I think in a way Scott has a bunch of like micro alibis throughout the day that don't allow for him to do the criminal activity he's convicted of.
Yeah.
Beyond that, we've had an ongoing investigation this entire time, and everything we learn just further confirms Scott's innocence and that he's wrongfully convicted. And it also is bringing us closer to finding out what really happened to Lacy and Connor.
In your heart of hearts, when was it that, or what was it, I should say, that kind of convinced you that Scott did not do this?
I've never thought that he did. So everything I've heard, I've measured against that possibility, and I've just never shifted.
What is Scott like? What kind of person is he? I mean, I know he's gone through the worst thing that anyone could ever imagine in the past 15, maybe 16 years. Not only did he lose his wife, he's accused of he was convicted of killing her and her unborn son, his own unborn son. But what kind of person was he before all this happened? That the Scott Peterson you knew back in 2001, what was he like?
You can look to the testimony of the 38 people I think it was around 38 people that testified during the penalty phase. And he was kind, hardworking, I'd say probably on the quieter side, but very good sense of humor. Just very gifted in a lot of things, and he and Lacy were, everything they did together was beautiful.
How is he doing now?
Well, we haven't been able to see him since early March because of the shutdown. So we've, the prison isn't allowing visits during the COVID pandemic, but we've had a few phone calls with him, and I think he's encouraged that oral arguments are finally happening. It's been a very long wait. So we're hopeful that the court will do the right thing and overturn this conviction. And we will find that out by the end of summer.
I can't imagine what you're going through. And how are you holding up? How is your husband holding up, Scott's brother, and the rest of the family?
Yeah. I think we've always just kind of looked at what's right in front of us. We don't look up and look too far ahead. If you start doing that, I think it can get a little overwhelming to think how long. If you would have told us that this would have taken this long, it would have been, I don't even know. Yeah. But we've just kind of plugged away with what's before us and focused on visiting him. And we've had, I think the first 8 years we had someone there to visit him every week. And and we're fortunate to be able to do that. And
the hope I'm sure you have for a new trial. What do you think the likelihood is that that's going to happen?
I'm pretty positive. I feel like we actually have a few different options for a new trial. Of course, I'm very hopeful that his appeal will overturn his conviction, but right on the heels of that, he also has a habeas petition that addresses new evidence, whereas the appeal that was just argued yesterday only addresses issues in the courtroom, like rulings made by the judge or evidence allowed or a juror removed, things like that. So right on the heels of his appeal, we would also have an opportunity to have his conviction overturned with his habeas petition, which has an additional 19 issues in it.
Thank you for joining me on the program, Janie.
Thank you, Tom.
Remember, this is just the evidence. It's up to you to decide what your opinion is. But let's base it all on evidence, facts, and there's more out there. Let's just touch the surface, of course. There's evidence that might lead one to believe that Scott was guilty, and there's evidence that might give some people pause now, and some realm of understanding that maybe Scott Peterson is innocent in this. Of course, the California Supreme Court now has about 90 days left to decide whether or not things remain the same, status quo, or that Scott Peterson gets a new trial. I would love your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at Tom Jordan News, or go to the WWJ Facebook page. You can go there as well. You can find me on Facebook also. And don't forget to listen to WWJ News Radio 950 every weekday morning with Roberta Jacina and me, the entire morning crew, as well, also on radio.com from 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. Eastern. Again, that's WWJ News Radio 950. Also find us live stream on radio.com. I'm Tom Jordan, and I've got issues.